Anin, Bojo, Sarah Hazel Dijnakas, Nibizing Donjaba. Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Hazel and I'm from Nipissing First Nation. I am also the project manager for the Canadian Archaeological Association's working group on unmarked graves. Today, I would like to thank you for joining me to talk about recommended procedures for interpreting ground-penetrating radar data. Before we get started, I'd just like to draw your attention to our online resources. Specifically, we have two comprehensive guides, one on investigation planning and one on the technical aspects of ground penetrating radar and other remote sensing applications, which you can view on our website, the link for which is provided on this page. Unmarked graves investigations can bring up distressing content, and it is important to take care of yourself mentally and emotionally while doing this work. Please make sure you have health supports in place, or you can call one of the numbers on this slide if you are feeling triggered and you can speak to a health professional. And I'm just going to leave this up for a couple of moments in case you'd like to write one of these numbers down. Interpreting GPR data is the most difficult part of the survey process. In this video, I present a simplified model of how to interpret GPR data and identify unmarked graves. There are three major steps of GPR interpretation. Number one, defining the context. Two, fundamentals of GPR and unmarked graves. And three, interpreting GPR burial traits. While it is important to understand how to identify characteristic GPR grave signals, it is equally important to be able to differentiate signals that are produced by the sediments surrounding the grave, i.e. the background geology, and other types of buried features. Therefore, it is necessary to consider several potential signals that may be produced from a GPR survey in the search for unmarked graves. The properties of the ground influence GPR reflection patterns. In general, the less that background sediments reflect a GPR signal, the easier it is to identify signal reflection patterns produced by burials. In other words, the more strongly a reflected signal from a burial contrasts with a weaker signal reflected from background geology, the more clear the burial features will appear. However, conditions differ in each context, so general principles are just a starting point, and a local assessment is necessary to develop a survey. Understanding how the background geology appears in the GPR signal is crucial for understanding what a burial might look like against that background. As such, the first step is to assess what the sediments are like in the survey area and develop some expectations for how they influence GPR signals in particular contexts. GPR assessments identify burials based on their contrast with surrounding sediments. In general, the GPR reflection corresponds to the contents, shape, and size of the grave shaft. Properties such as moisture retention, compaction, and inclusion, such as rocks and metals, also influence GPR. Most archaeological research has focused on recent cemeteries where there is a pattern of relatively deep, 1 to 2 meters, approximately, roughly rectangular, adult-sized graves. The GPR patterns of informal graves that include other shapes and/or sizes are less well understood and may be less obvious to interpret in the data. To be able to identify graves using GPR, it is essential to understand the basic principles of the method. Our understanding of how GPR signals operate in burial contexts comes from three sources. One, field research where GPR data is collected from known burials. Two, simulations of GPR using software. And three, geophysical theory and scholarship. Field research is the collection of GPR data from known burial settings. Most published research has focused on modern, formal cemeteries in temperate zones. As GPR is more widely applied in IRS landscapes, the understanding of how GPR works in a wider variety of situations will advance. The larger the sample of known examples, the better our ability will be to define the traits of different kinds of burials in different conditions. Simulation involves the use of software to mimic GPR reflection patterns of simulated targets in modeled conditions. With simulations, we can create hypothetical geological conditions and various targets, generating a set of traits we should expect from GPR reflections of different kinds of graves. For example, this figure shows a modeled grave in GPR sim software. The top left image shows a simulated grave in the software. The lower left is the resulting radargram that the software creates. This work is in its early stages, and the CAA is developing a separate guidance document on how to use and interpret the results of simulations. The behavior of a GPR signal traveling through the ground can be complex. Their movements are dictated by the signal's wavelength and frequency, which are inversely related. The lower the frequency, the greater the depth of a GPR signal can travel through the ground. Conversely, with higher frequencies, the GPR will be able to travel less distance, but detect smaller features at a higher resolution. If GPR is configured for deeper penetration, it will only detect bigger objects. Most cemetery surveys use frequencies between 100 and 1000 megahertz, allowing for depths of a few meters and detection of objects smaller than a meter. GPR detects subsurface patterns because some materials in the ground reflect signals back to the device, which are recorded. Two principal effects cause signal returns. The first is that materials cause the radar wave to reflect off a surface like a mirror. And the second is when passing between different materials, the radar wave changes direction and some are reflected back to the device. Both effects occur in GPR and produce patterns in a reflection profile that we interpret as materials, objects, and features. In formal cemeteries, GPR can be used to detect graves confidently for several reasons. First, there are few anomalies of similar size and shape in such landscapes. Second, graves frequently occur in patterns such as rows, assisting the identification of individual graves. And third, the rectangular planes of grave shafts produce characteristic reflective patterns visible in the vertical images, or radargrams. Because of these properties, interpretation of burials in cemeteries using GPR data can often be straightforward. IRS landscapes, however, will present more complex environments because there are many unknown variables. Burial shafts may lack standard rectangular shapes, they may not be arranged in patterns such as rows, and they may exist in geologically complex sediments. This combination of unknown factors means that graves will likely present less reliable visibility, and the background signal may be noisier. Since we currently lack a wide variety of GPR data samples from unmarked grave contexts, interpretation continues to be a work in progress. The specific GPR traits associated with burials are varied, and it is unclear if these characteristics are consistent in different geological conditions. However, a trait-based approach to GPR interpretation is emerging that allows researchers to identify specific GPR features associated with graves. As previously mentioned, geophysical theory and simulations can assist, especially as the sample of known burials with GPR results increases. Grave traits are interpreted with the use of two visual aids, amplitude maps and radargrams, although radargrams are the primary source of interpretations. Radargrams visualize a linear sequence of radar scans on the ground, which are collected as one moves the GPR machine across the ground surface. The radargram shows the amplitude of the reflected signal as a visualization in profile, as though seeing the subsurface from the side. Radargrams are both the source of data for amplitude maps and most useful in identifying buried features. This figure shows three profiles or radargrams from different parts of a cemetery. Hyperbolic-shaped reflections or diffractions indicating probable graves are highlighted by white boxes and numbers. These numbers correspond with positions on the amplitude map of the cemetery, which is in the right of this figure. When GPR lines are collected in grids, the results can be presented and viewed in 3D. They are typically shown in a series of plan view or bird's eye view at different depths called amplitude maps. From this vantage, graves within cemeteries typically have characteristic patterning both as roughly rectangular anomalies and as arrangements of anomalies in rows. In such contexts, the amplitude map may appear to be confirmation of graves using GPR. However, data from radargrams should be cross-referenced for identification. The survey plot in this image on the right has been overlaid by profile interpretations. The plus sign are probable graves. The small circles are possible graves. The black star denotes a grave identified with two techniques, and the solid black circles represent obstructions. Three 2D amplitude maps are included in the survey area. Notice that the amplitude changes, darker equals higher amplitude, corresponding with our numbered graves. A recent assessment of GPR applications to detect unmarked burials identifies at least 23 different GPR signal patterns or traits found in radargrams of known burials from 73 different published sources. Since many of these characteristics are only documented in a few of the analyses, the identification of GPR traits associated with burials remains a complicated problem. However, these challenges are not insurmountable, and guidance will improve with both the application and interpretation of GPR surveys and ongoing methods evaluations, both as field tests and simulations. At this stage, we have determined the two most common traits evidenced in radargrams are stratigraphic discontinuities and hyperbolic shapes. Stratigraphic discontinuities are patterns of horizontal difference or low amplitude reflections representing the grave shaft in the surrounding sediments. They appear in most radargrams that intersect a grave, but are most visible in radargrams that intersect a rectangular grave shaft at right angles. Traits are most often visible at the lowest depth of the grave. Figure A shows examples of graves as observed in a radargram. Yellow arrows denote identified diffraction hyperbolas. The difference between the areas in and above the diffraction hyperbolas and the areas between the areas can be thought of as evidence of stratigraphic discontinuities. Hyperbolic shapes are convex shapes that appear in radargrams above and within rectangular grave shafts, particularly across the width of the grave. They are likely caused by the difference in physical properties between the material filling the grave shaft and the surrounding material, which causes the GPR waves to reflect from the bottom and the walls of the shaft and concentrate in a curved shape above. Figure B shows an amplitude map showing the same graves identified in A, but in plan view. Despite the identified challenges, we can note the following. In cemetery contexts, burials are frequently visible in amplitude maps as rectangular anomalies representing the grave shaft. However, there are known examples of burials that do not appear as clear anomalies in amplitude maps, suggesting that identification should always be cross-referenced with radargram data. The most common traits of a burial in GPR are stratigraphic discontinuities and hyperbolic shapes. Our experiences suggest that these traits are most visible when survey grids are oriented both perpendicular and parallel to grave orientation when possible. In summary, there are several GPR signal patterns that are indicative of graves, but these vary and our knowledge of the range of variation is incomplete. The suite of potential traits that occur are affected by local geological patterns and burial treatments and contents. More refinement of our methods of interpretation will benefit the application of GPR to the identification of burials outside of the cemetery contexts and in informal and clandestine locations. This module has attempted to underline the importance of step-by-step and methodologically grounded interpretations of GPR data. Because of variable conditions, no single strategy can be applied to every context, and this will be reflected in the associated GPR technical report. For communities that are hiring outside specialists, the following is a list of information and items that should be included in a GPR technical report. Number 1, an explanation of interpretations, including annotations on radargrams and amplitude maps with precise descriptions and examples of patterns. Number 2, a detailed methodology that explains how the data were collected, processed, and then interpreted. This should include an example of raw, processed, and interpreted radargrams and/or amplitude maps. Number 3, explanations of confidence terms used in the report. These can include probable, possible, or likely. Number 4, copies of all forms of data should be included with the report for archival purposes. This includes a full set of collected and processed data files, as well as radargrams and amplitude maps. Number 5, photographs, if appropriate, of each survey area showing the ground conditions. Number 6, maps showing the location of survey grids in relation to other features of the site. And finally, number 7, maps locating the identified features in relation to visible surface features and location coordinates. Miigwech, thank you for joining me for this module on GPR interpretation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at shazel3@uwo.ca. Take care.